This conference will now be recorded.
Hare Krishna, welcome back to our online Bhagavad Gita reading retreat labs. So today we will cover the last section of the chapter number 3, that is Karma Yoga, and we will read from verse number 36 to verse number 43. And here it is discussed all about the lust, how to conquer the greatest enemy of the mankind, the lust and anger. So without any delay, let's go back to our Veda base. We'll start from reading from chapter number 3, verse number 36. As usual, we will be only reading through the translation and purport. We will not be going word by word meaning. Translation. Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? Purport. A living entity is part and parcel of the Supreme, is originally spiritual, pure, and free from all material contaminations. Therefore, by nature, he is not subject to the sins of the material world. But when he is in contact with the material nature, he acts in many sinful ways without hesitation, and sometimes even against his will. As such, Arjuna's question to Krishna is very sanguine as to the perverted nature of the living entities. Although the living entity sometimes doesn't want to act in sin, he is still forced to act. Sinful actions are not, however, impelled by the super soul within, but are due to another cause, as the Lord explains in the next verse. That is the chapter number next verse, in the next verse, chapter number 3, verse number 37. Translation. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact, the material mode of passion, and latter transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world. When a living entity comes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in association with the mode of passion. Or, in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust, as milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. Then again, when lust is unsatisfied, it turns into wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion, and illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and it is lust only which induces the pure living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as wrath and other corollaries. If, therefore, the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from the degradation of wrath by spiritual attachment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are parts and parcels of this spiritual bliss. They also have partial independence, but by misuse of their independence, when the service attitude is transformed into propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give facility to conditioned souls to fulfill these lustful propensities. And when completely baffled by the prolonged lustful activities, the living entities begin to inquire about their real position. This inquiry is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutras, wherein it is said, Atata Brahma Jigyasa, one should inquire into the Supreme. And the Supreme is defined in Srimad Bhagavatam page Janmadi Asya Yato Anyadi Prahitascha. The origin of everything is the Supreme Brahman. Therefore, the origin of lust is also in the Supreme. If, therefore, lust is transformed into love for the Supreme or transformed into Krishna consciousness, or in other words, desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. Hanuman, the great servitor of Lord Rama, exhibited his wrath by burning the golden city of Ravana, but by doing so, he became the greatest devotee of the Lord. Here also, in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord induces Arjuna to engage his wrath upon his enemies for the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they are employed in Krishna consciousness, become our friends instead of our enemies. Now we move to the next verse, chapter number 3, verse number 38. Translation: is fire is covered by smoke, is the mirror is covered by dust, or is the embryo is covered by the womb. The living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Purport. There are three degrees of covering of the living entity by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations like smoke in the fire, dust in the mirror, and the wound about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to the fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary when where there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating a helpless position of the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such a great exhibition of lust that they are almost void of all consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the bars and beasts, and the smoke covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of a human being, the living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and if it makes further development, the fire in spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire, fire can be made to blush. Therefore, the human form of the life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy lust by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under able guidance. Now we move to the next verse. That Gita chapter number 3, verse number 39. Translation. Thus, the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. But said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Maithunya Agara, or the circus of sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the laws of the law are shackled by sex life. Advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of the material existence of a living entity. Therefore, this lust, the symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world, while one enjoys sense gratification. It may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually, that is so called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoy. Now we'll move to the next verse, chapter number 3, verse number 14. Translation. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Purport. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places, so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all the activities of the senses, and thus, when we hear about sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification. And as a result, the mind and the senses become the repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter, and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam 10.84.13. Jasata uti pinapidhatuke swadhi tasu bhaumya yadhi yat tirtha buddhi alilina karchi janeswa abhigyesu saeva gothara. So this is one of the verse, very important verse from Srimad Bhagavatam. Even Srila Prabhupada also gives this example in many of his lectures. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsman, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge, there is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Now we'll move to the next verse, chapter number 3, verse number 51, translation. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, carve this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Therefore, the Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses for the very beginning so that he could carve the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the arts for self-realization and specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to the knowledge of self, as distinguished from non-self. Or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to the specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to the supreme soul. It is explained thus in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2.9.P1. Jnanam paramam guhyam me yad vijnana samanvitam sarahasyam angam cha grihana gaditam maya. The knowledge of the self and supreme self is very confidential and mysterious. But such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord Himself. The Bhagavad Gita gives us that general and specific knowledge of the self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So, from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following out regulative principles of devotional service. So, from any stage of life or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness. Devotional service of the Lord and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Now we move to the next verse, chapter number 3, verse number 42. Translation. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And the soul is even higher than the intelligence. Purport. The senses are different outlets for the activity of lust. Lust is reserved within the body, but is given vent to the senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is superior consciousness or Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the highlight of bodily functions is described here ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means the functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act as it does during dreaming. But above the mind is the determination of the intelligence, and above the intelligence is the soul proper. If therefore the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely the intelligence, mind, and senses, will be automatically engaged. In the Katha there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses, and mind is superior to the sense objects. If, therefore, the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance that the senses will become engaged in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. Param drishtva nivartati. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely the sense object, the senses, and the mind and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of the senses. But aside from that, one has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness by complete surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger. And even though the senses are very strong, like serpents, they will be no more effective than serpents with broken fangs. But even though the soul is the master of intelligence and mind, and the senses also, still, unless it is strengthened by association of with Krishna in Krishna consciousness, there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. Now we will move to the next verse. That is chapter number 3, verse number 43. Translation. Thus, knowing oneself to the transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty Aunt Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Purport. This third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directed to Krishna consciousness. By knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness, the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for lording, and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses and the mind and intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind, by steady intelligence directed toward one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man toward spiritual lives. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. So with this, we have completed chapter number 3 Bhagavad Gita. So in this section, we have seen how to conquer the lost. In the last section, it was number 41 to 43 by first regulating the senses. And one should not try to conquer over the mind and intelligence first because they are more powerful than the senses. And basically, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. So here, spiritual intelligence refers to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence. So one can So by spiritual strength only, one can conquer this formidable enemy, which is known as lust. So with this, we completed the chapter number 3, that is Karma Yoga. So in the next session onwards, we will start with the next chapter, that is chapter number 4, which is transcendental knowledge. Hare Krishna.